Story 1. I think propaganda affects people's minds and creates unnecessary hate. I am a veteran, and when the September 11th attacks happened, I joined the military out of anger towards the Middle East. They seemed like terrorists to me, and I felt they needed to be taught a lesson. However, what I experienced was meeting humble people who were too busy trying to survive and acquire food on a daily basis. Despite their struggles, they welcomed many U.S. soldiers into their homes and provided us with meals during our overnight security details. Most people are just trying to live a normal life. Story 2. I feel sad for them, honestly. The vast majority of people in this world do not want to fight in any wars. They want to live their lives, raise their families, and go about their business in relative peace. It is a shame that megalomaniacal sociopaths occasionally rise to power and use their own constituents as pawns in a game to satisfy their own egos. Story 3. It is despicable. Putin is willing to sacrifice a generation of young men for what is currently absolutely nothing. Story 4. Casualties, not deaths. 870,000 deaths means that there are 87 full divisions of killed in action. This indicates at least 2.5 million total casualties, which equates to 250 divisions worth of dead and wounded. Now consider the 50% casualty rate when a division is fully engaged. This suggests that Russia has deployed up to 500 divisions in small Ukraine. That is physically impossible in today's world. Even if you assume some wounded personnel are returned to action, that still represents an absurd number of troops that Russia does not have in actual units. Story 5. Those 870,000 men are a combination of killed and wounded. Some wounded soldiers return to the battlefield. Indeed, Russian soldiers have been filmed on crutches at the front line. We do not know the actual number of deaths. Story 6. Keep in mind this information comes from Ukrainian sources, which may inflate numbers. What we can be sure of is that there are 110,000 confirmed dead. Story 7. No one claims this information. Ukraine and the United States do not even acknowledge this number. Averaging all estimates, except those from opposing countries, results in a ratio of approximately 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 in favor of Ukraine. Reddit continues to spread misinformation while labeling any perspectives they disagree with as propaganda. Story 8. I am more concerned about the Ukrainian soldiers losing their lives right now because the United States has stopped all support and does not allow the United Kingdom to share its intelligence. Story 9. Not much, unfortunately. That is an order of magnitude less than Russia is accustomed to expending in conflict. They are not going to become hesitant about sacrificing lives just because this is the 21st century. Story 10. Sadly, it doesn't matter if it's 1 million or 10. Putin is content with throwing everyone into the meat grinder. Story 11. Any loss of life is tragic and distressing. It is upsetting to witness people being thrown to their deaths for someone else's ambitions. Story 12. The numbers are inconsistent, and I don't think we will truly know how many were killed. Russians brought mobile cremation trucks because they did not want bodies returning to Russia. Families of the deceased have received bags of potatoes, food processors, and other worthless items when their loved ones were reported dead. I also feel that Putin is afraid to end the war, not because of any land he wants to gain, but because the soldiers fighting in Ukraine will return to Russia and will likely be angry. Story 13. Are you serious? It seems we need to feel sympathy for the armed soldiers who came to a foreign country to invade. What about the unarmed civilians, including children, who were killed by them in Ukraine? What about those who were raped and tortured? Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave their homes. Let's not blur the line between the aggressor and the victim. We should not forget the tragic consequences of war for all those affected. Story 14. Russia has been sending a disproportionate number of individuals from indigenous communities into the war. It appears they are attempting to address 2 genocides with one action. Story 15. It's a very good start. May they lose 20,000 men every day until Russia finally goes home and puts this entire atrocious and pointlessly destabilizing situation behind it once and for all. Story 16. There hasn't been a war yet where the casualty estimates of your opponent during the conflict have been accurate. We don't know. I can only say that no matter what the real number of dead and wounded soldiers are, I wish it would be much higher. But we can still draw a couple of conclusions from the Russian casualties that we know. They are high, very high for the small gains they are making. Armor and vehicle losses are well documented and excessive, and if we look at the kind of soldiers they are sending to the front, it's concerning. They depleted their best units early in the war. They have little to no regard for their own soldiers' lives. From what we know, the number of killed in action among casualties is significantly higher than it should be if they actually cared about medical care. All in all, absolutely nothing new. Every military action taken by Russia since 1850, besides sending tanks to suppress civilian uprisings, has been a complete disaster. Even their victory in World War II was a significant display of incompetence. Story 17. If we are getting closer to Putin running out of Russians to send, it is a positive development. Perhaps the Russian people will begin to love their sons more than they fear or love Putin. Story 18. I don't care what side they are on. Those poor men most likely had families or loved ones. If one person dies and 20 people show up at their funeral, just think about how many lives have been affected by this. It's unimaginable. Story 19. Are they really Russian citizens or just pretending to be Russians from whatever country around the world that was promised a meat grinder? Story 20. It's about a million too few, apparently. This is not my opinion. It is Putin's. Russia shouldn't be invading a peaceful neighbor, but apparently 870,000 casualties are not enough for him to accept that. My personal dream would be 0 casualties, which would have been the case if Putin had just left Ukraine alone. Story 21. 870,000 people have died, been wounded, or become permanently disabled due to this conflict. There are significant casualties on the side of Ukraine as well, who were living their lives peacefully and now face immense suffering. Russian citizens are engaged in a war that seems senseless, driven by the ego of a leader who lacks popular support and has to manipulate elections to maintain power. They are fighting against individuals who simply wanted to live their lives. And it is not over yet. Story 22. Those are rookie numbers. Increase them. Russia never cared for its people anyway, but it means more safety for us. Story 23. It is a tragedy. I, like many people who grew up in the Soviet Union, care about casualties on both sides. The war did not have to start, and once it did not have to last that long. Story 24. It is extremely upsetting because it means Russia has a significant sunk cost. If they cannot confidently declare victory, it will be the end for Putin. He is backed into a corner and therefore becomes even more dangerous. Story 25. Almost 1 million people have died, and families have been needlessly ruined due to the bloodlust and insanity of their leader, Vladimir Putin. Story 26. I think it is really disappointing. I hope one day we can blend our cultures more so that these situations occur less often. Story 27. I think that figure is not accurate. Russia is losing about 2 to 3 troops for every Ukrainian that dies. However, Russia has about 4 times the population. This is why Russia continues to make slow advances. The one time Ukraine made a significant push and achieved any meaningful gains against Russia, it suffered very heavy losses, with about 2 dead for every Russian death. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war of attrition, and it is losing. Story 28. Sadly, they have more cannon fodder to lose. Ukraine cannot maintain attrition in the same way that Russia can. Story 29. I feel sympathy for the conscripts. It is also a nightmare for their families and support systems. Their communities are worse off, and it is all for the wrong reasons. I empathize with the entirety of the people. They deserve to be free and to have fair elections. Now, seemingly under a fascist dictatorship, I can understand the citizens who disagree and resist. Vladimir Putin and his administration are responsible for these deaths, future deaths, and countless civilian casualties in Ukraine. He has repeatedly demonstrated that he is incapable of modern leadership. Putin must be removed, and his regime must fall. War must stop everywhere. Unfortunately, a rogue nation-state with a tyrannical warmongering leader is not new. They can be defeated there. They can be defeated here. Sadly, this is what America could become if we do not stand up right now. Story 30. I believe that in Russia, as always, human life has no value. People have learned this the hard way, and everyone keeps their head down to avoid drawing any attention. This is a nation of individuals who will go to great lengths to ignore how troubled they are. Story 31. Casualties and deaths are not the same thing. Framing the figure as 870,000 lost is misleading, as individuals can become casualties multiple times through wounds and recovery, as well as going missing and being found, captured and returned, or affected by illness. This distinction is important to understand. The more accurate estimate is approximately 180,000 dead, based on corroboration from various sources across different countries, including Russia's own total manpower estimates. Story 32. Russia started an unnecessary war. War has casualties, unfortunately. Never did I think I would see this happening in the United States, but I now see that anything is possible. Story 33. It's unfortunate for those who are dying, but given Russia's demographic crisis, the population of their young men will not be restored, which means fewer soldiers in the future. Since I live in a country bordering Russia, every soldier that dies in Ukraine is one less who might invade my land if Russia decides to come this way. Ultimately, Russia depleting its manpower is a net positive for neighboring countries and the world as a whole. On a personal level, I have completely desensitized myself to any empathy for their troops. If the Russians have an issue with hundreds of thousands of their own being sent abroad as invaders to die over small scraps of war-torn land for their leader to enjoy, they are welcome to take action. Otherwise, every nation being invaded has the sovereign right and duty to defend itself against invaders. I do not view the high casualty rates of invaders as a tragedy, but rather as justice. The real tragedy lies in the many lives they ruin through their invasions. Story 34. That's how wars are fought, unfortunately. If the other side can fight back, you will lose a significant number of people, often sacrificing hundreds and even thousands for trivial gains. My biggest complaint is that Russian government officials can secure safe positions for themselves and their children while claiming to have participated in the war without actually facing danger. It is easy to send others to their deaths. I also fail to understand the logic of those who look at these casualties and think, Russia will invade other countries if allowed to achieve its goals in Ukraine. Even if Russia wins, it will be akin to a street fight where the loser is taken away in a body bag and the winner in an ambulance. The economic and demographic damage will take decades to resolve, if it can be resolved at all. Story 35. I feel sorry for the soldiers who wanted no part in this war. However, it makes me happy to know that Putin is a failure. So much for winning. Story 36. I believe it. Putin stated it was a military exercise when they announced the invasion to the troops. His army was completely untrained for this. He has had to conscript civilians to keep troops on the front line and recruit North Koreans. Story 37. I can see the numbers are being debated. I have no clue about the numbers, but I do know that they recruited prisoners, mercenaries, North Koreans, and now donkeys. Honestly, I'm not that scared of them taking over Europe. True, they have a huge arsenal, but they also need hands to carry them. It seems more evident that they are running out again. They also have nuclear weapons, but they are not the only ones. I hope the world can ensure Ukraine's safety before they recruit more donkeys. Story 38. This is why Donald Trump is concerned about Russia losing. He will do anything to help them win, and by doing this, he wastes an opportunity to move on from the old Soviet past once and for all. Story 39. Approximately 160,000 Russian deaths have been independently confirmed. Russian authorities do not release their statistics, and Ukrainian sources may exaggerate the figures to boost their soldiers' morale. Story 40. Every day I wait for the announcement of former President Trump wanting to supply Russia with American troops, and for World War III to break out over it. Story 41. It's difficult to understand how distorted one's mind and perception of reality must be to believe that what Vladimir Putin is doing is acceptable. I cannot fathom how warped he is to behave in this manner. He feels alien. Story 42. I think it's sad. Russians are people. Most did not want this war. There was no reason for it. Putin is a monster sending his country to its doom. Yet, former President Trump is throwing him a lifeline because he sees the two largest nuclear arsenals as a very effective global bully. Story 43. I keep thinking about how some people claim that women are naturally obedient, and then you look at the world and see what men are willing to sacrifice their lives for, often just because they have been told to. Story 44. Human life doesn't matter for such a dictatorship. What matters are imperial dreams of recovering the glory of a long-lost empire and the resources they can obtain, such as mineral mines and land. 1 million lives for such ambition is not a significant price in their eyes. Story 45. Russia can lose 1 million soldiers as easily as if it were pocket change. There are still 79 million deaths to account for before reaching the losses from World War II. Story 46. It's incredible that Putin has been able to maintain a majority of public support after 3 years of a conflict he refused to acknowledge. If these figures are accurate, Russia has already lost about 15 times the number of soldiers that the United States lost during the Vietnam conflict, and they have little to show for it. I believe that we are giving Putin a lifeline to retain everything he has gained and declare victory. Story 47. I'm sure the mothers of those soldiers are upset, but can't do anything because Putin will send them to labor camps. Story 48. My cousin married a Russian man in 2019. His entire friend group from university is gone, all 6 of them. Story 49. It is truly baffling. The psychology of authoritarian individuals is quite unfamiliar to me. Story 50. Russia does not care about its citizens or soldiers. They will continue to draft random lower-class ethnic individuals and send them to the front lines as they did in the 1940s until they achieve their goals. They are acting immorally. Story 51. It is easy to think that they are losing, but those 870,000 people are not Vladimir Putin. The vast majority of them have no idea what they are fighting for and have been misled into believing that Putin is correct. Additionally, their economic situation may be so dire that they feel they have no other choice but to join the army. Story 52. It is a good start. However, I would prefer if Putin followed his father's example and simply withdrew. Story 53. It is completely fabricated. There is no way that Russia has lost that many people. It is a territorial conflict between neighboring countries, not World War III. Story 54. If I were Russian, I would lament the obliteration of the working class, dooming them to never have the power to rise up against their oppressive ruling elite. However, I am not Russian. I can only perceive Russia as a state entity engaging in state crimes consistently. What I take from this, as many have commented elsewhere, is that Russia is a paper tiger. The threat throughout the Cold War, which probably never really ended, was a massive Soviet war machine capable of invading and crushing us if provoked. This so-called bogeyman has been halted in its tracks by a small nation's army, toy drones, and trenches. Ultimately, what truly stopped it was the ruling elite's kleptocratic draining of the strength of their military into their own pockets. I wonder if their nuclear arsenal is even capable of delivering a strike. They certainly desire Ukraine and its nuclear facilities back very much. All in all, I do not believe we should consider Russia a world power anymore. Since they are trying to take America down with them, I would say that just leaves China and perhaps the United Kingdom. Story 55. They are not an armed power, let alone a world power. We should be taking a strong stance against Putin. Instead, we are appeasing him, which is disgraceful. Story 56. I feel sorry for the individual people affected, who will not receive any serious support from their ungrateful and corrupt government. However, I feel even worse for the Ukrainians who are about to be betrayed. Ultimately, I would increase that number to secure Ukraine's borders, which were promised by Russia and the United States in the 1990s. Russia is responsible for these circumstances, and the blame lies with the elites and Vladimir Putin. Story 57. Wow, that is a heavy toll. War is always devastating, and the loss of so many lives is truly tragic. It is a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict. Story 58. I blame Putin, but I also blame the Russian population. People of a country have a responsibility to keep their governments in check. Unfortunately, that means if they get out of hand, You have to go through a revolution regardless of how comfortable your couch is. If you get tricked by propaganda, you are at fault for being uninformed. If you are a soldier, you are at fault for being treated as merely a pawn in a larger conflict. I don't see Russians doing enough when they are the ones invading a country. Americans are next. Better make sure your government doesn't step out of line, or it is your duty to take action. Hopefully, Russians decide to read a book or something, stop killing people over the past or government agendas, and start fighting for humanity, looking toward the future instead of the past. I would never kill another human if someone told me to unless I know why. If I were a Ukrainian soldier, I would know why I was shooting at Russians. If I were a Russian soldier shooting at Ukraine, I would feel like a murderer, not just Putin, he's merely a figurehead. Story 59. It's a bit dated now, but it's a good video on the approximate total deaths in Russia. They calculate the benefits paid out to family members. Story 60. Working as a war correspondent opened my eyes. The official numbers rarely tell the whole story, but 870,000 is like wiping out the entire population of a major city. Story 61. I am very skeptical that we can know the real number with any degree of accuracy. However, I am not going to cheer for their deaths specifically. It is a huge waste of life. I am glad for any time Ukraine gains a tactical or strategic advantage, or when the capabilities of Putin's armies are degraded by any means. Killing people on the front lines is a necessary part of fighting a war, but any time the same can be achieved by, for example, blowing up an ammunition depot with minimal loss of life, that is a more elegant kind of victory. Killing the adversary may be a way to win, but it is not the goal in itself. Story 62. War is always tragic, and those who decide to engage in wars often do so while remaining in comfortable and safe places, sending others to their deaths. Story 63. It is a horrific waste of life, and for what purpose? I despise Putin, but I feel sympathy for ordinary Russians, especially those who understand how pointless the war is. I also feel for the Ukrainians. It is possible to empathize with multiple groups of people at the same time. Story 64. I believe that the entire front line, along with every weapon that has harmed any civilian, should be directed towards Putin. Story 65. Let's start by addressing the intentional twisting of words in your original post. They have an estimated 800,000 wounded and killed combined. They have at most 200,000 dead, probably closer to half that. They didn't lose soldiers. Many of those wounded can be redeployed or can work civilian roles in their military operations. I think a loss of 2 to 1 soldiers compared to the Ukrainian forces in an offensive war is quite reasonable, especially given the poor state of Russian equipment and the advanced technology, logistical, and intelligence support the Ukrainians have received from the West. Additionally, considering that Russia has more or less secured its 2 primary objectives, denying Europe access to oil fields in the east and securing Crimea, it can be seen as a successful battlefield engagement. The Russians did have to sacrifice their foothold in Syria to achieve this, but it seems that the United States recognizes for now that further gains cannot be easily made against Russia without a significant financial investment, making it no longer worthwhile. Killing almost 2 million people over Ukrainian oil and gas fields is to be expected in a world governed by industrial financial oligarchs. Story 66. Unfortunately, the Russians seem to only consider this a good beginning. The people most hurt by this war are obviously the Ukrainians, as the conflict is being fought on their land. However, Russia will feel the ramifications for decades, long after Ukraine has surpassed every pre-war benchmark. Story 67. I have already reaped the benefits of suddenly being considered eligible to date a girl in Russia who otherwise would have been out of my league. It was a fun 3 years. Story 68. An actual tragedy. There is a moment in The Lord of the Rings where the protagonist reflects on the men who have gone to war. Were they truly evil at heart? What motives drove them to fight? And would they not have preferred to stay home? Tragedy. Story 69. Putin should have been one of them. Netanyahu can join later. Both proved to be more dangerous than Kim of North Korea. Story 70. How do you feel about believing Ukrainian claims? As far as I know, no side lost that many. It was 85,000 for Russia and 590,000 for Ukraine. Story 71. Not surprising considering their extreme tactics. It's just insane how little their generals and Vladimir Putin care about their own people. Story 72. It does not affect the regime's image. Russia is vast, so it is possible to diversify recruitment in a way that appears as if everything is business as usual. Story 73. Russia will likely lose over 1 million soldiers before this is over. The last time Russia experienced such heavy losses was in World War II, which they referred to as the Great Patriotic War. What will they call this conflict? Putin's great obsession, or perhaps the great disregard for our people war? Story 74. Committing genocide against your own people, many of whom are likely forced to fight, raises serious questions. The Russian population could have had a better chance if 800,000 people had stormed Putin and removed him from power. The fact that the Russian people have not overthrown Putin yet deserves further examination. Story 75. It's fine. The more they lose now, the less chance they have of invading Europe later on. Hopefully, they can recover and fade into history. Story 76. Putin doesn't care. Russia has lost 1% of its total male population, and that 1% is in the 18 to 50 age range. But Putin will happily sacrifice 10 or 20 times that number to recreate a greater Russia or Soviet Union. Story 77. People think it's a lot, and it is. However, during World War II, Russia lost 8.7 million troops. Russia is nowhere near its pain threshold. Story 78. My Russian neighbor hasn't heard from her brother since March. She says many families back home are in the same situation. They just stop receiving calls or letters. Story 79. I think the war needs to end. I do not care who wins. Just bring it to a conclusion. Why are young people dying for this? Story 80. Russian leaders never cared about the number of dead. Stalin used them as cannon fodder, and they were shot by their own security forces if they retreated in World War II, resulting in 40 million deaths. Story 81. Those are low numbers. Russia should be losing many more. Here's hoping Vladimir Putin follows in the footsteps of Muammar Gaddafi as soon as possible. Story 82. I believe there are consequences for the actions of Russia. Throughout their history, there have been multiple opportunities to address the situation, but they have been missed. At some point, Russia needs to make wise choices. Story 83. I highly doubt the casualties are that high. I think it is incredibly inflated, and we will not know accurate numbers until long after the war is over. Story 84. Thank God. It means they are less likely to invade the United States during the current turmoil, and perhaps even Europe. Story 85. If that's true, my first thought is that it's one Russian killed for every $300,000. Before people say I am despicable for doing the math, I have been told by many that the primary reason the North Atlantic Treaty Organization needs to support Ukraine is to weaken the Russian army through a proxy war. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.